A biker gang spent the night mocking and humiliating a quiet old man at a dive bar. They spilled his drink and threw his jacket. They didn't know the man was a disguised Steven Seagal, patiently waiting. The Iron Horse Saloon wasn't a place you found by accident, it was a destination for those whom the rest of the world tried to forget. Tucked away on a dusty, forgotten highway in the California desert, it was a squat, cinderblock building that seemed to bake and blister under the relentless sun. Inside, the air was a thick cocktail of stale beer, grease from the grill, and the faint, acrid smell of old leather and unwashed denim. A battered jukebox in the corner relentlessly pounded out a bass-heavy classic rock anthem, while the sharp crack of pool balls and the boisterous, rumbling laughter of its patrons filled what little silence remained. This was a place of loud noises and hard edges, a sanctuary for the rough and the restless. It was into this cauldron of aggressive masculinity that a new figure entered. The heavy door creaked open, admitting a slice of the fading twilight and a man who was the antithesis of everything the saloon represented. He was older, likely in his 60s, with a large, imposing frame that was softened by his unassuming attire, a weathered brown leather jacket that had seen 1,000 miles, faded blue jeans, and worn, dusty boots. His dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and a well-groomed salt and pepper beard framed a stern, impassive face. This was Steven Seagal, on a long, solitary drive through the desert, seeking only a quiet corner, a glass of bourbon, and a moment's peace. His presence was a note of profound, resonant silence in a room dedicated to noise. A few heads turned, registered him as a non-threat, just another road-weary traveler, and immediately dismissed him. He walked slowly to the bar, his movements deliberate and economical, ordered his bourbon neat, and carried it to an empty, secluded booth by a grimy window, turning his back to the room. The de facto kings of the Iron Horse Saloon held court in a large, circular booth at the center of the room. They were the Desert Vipers, a local biker club whose reputation was built on bar fights and intimidation. Their leader was a man known only as Razor. He was a bull of a man in his late 30s, with a shaved head, a neck as thick as a telephone pole, and arms covered in faded, prison-quality tattoos. He sat leaned back, a bottle of beer in his fist, surveying his kingdom with the lazy, proprietary arrogance of a predator who knows he is the strongest thing in the jungle. It was one of his lieutenants who noticed Seagal first. He nudged Razor, jerking his chin toward the quiet figure in the corner booth. "Hey, check out the new guy," he muttered. "Sits down at old man Hemlock's table. Didn't even ask." Razor's cold, reptilian eyes shifted, locking onto Seagal's back. He watched for a moment, a slow, cruel smirk spreading across his face. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, an old man, alone, trying to be invisible. In Razor's world, invisibility was an invitation to be seen, and solitude was a challenge to be broken. "Looks like a retired librarian," another biker snorted. "Nah, maybe a roadie for some washed-up band got lost on his way to the casino," Razor chuckled, his voice a low growl that carried across the bar. "Doesn't even have the decency to take his hat off indoors." Seagal wasn't wearing a hat, but facts were irrelevant. The point was to establish a target, to create a spectacle for the entertainment of his pack. He took a long swallow of his beer, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. The quiet man in the corner had just become the evening's entertainment. Razor didn't approach himself. That wasn't his style. He preferred to test his prey with his underlings first. He nodded at Tank, a bald, bearded giant of a man whose leather vest was stained and torn. "Go welcome the new guy to the neighborhood," Razor said, a dangerous glint in his eye. Tank grinned, understanding the command perfectly. He grabbed a fresh, full pint of beer from the bar and began a lumbering, deliberate stroll past Seagal's booth. As he passed, he executed a clumsy, theatrical, stumble, lurching sideways. A wave of cold, foamy beer sloshed from his pint, splashing across the table and soaking the sleeve of Seagal's weathered leather jacket. "Whoa there." "Oops," Tank grunted, making a poor show of surprise. "My bad, old-timer. Slippery floors, you know." He smirked, waiting for the inevitable angry reaction, a shouted curse, a shove, something to justify a physical response. He got nothing. Seagal didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at Tank. Instead, he slowly set down his glass of bourbon. With a calm, almost meditative precision, he reached for the stack of cheap paper napkins on the table. He took one, slowly and deliberately wiped the beer from his jacket sleeve, then took another and carefully patted the puddle on the table dry. His breathing never changed. His expression remained a mask of placid neutrality. It was as if a minor, insignificant inconvenience had occurred, one not even worthy of his attention. This absolute lack of reaction was more infuriating to Tank than any insult could have been. It was a silent, profound dismissal. He stood there for a moment, his smirk faltering, before grumbling under his breath and stalking back to his table. "Dude's a zombie," he reported back to Razor, who was now watching with narrowed, calculating eyes. Seagal's quiet defiance was a direct challenge to his authority, and Razor knew he had to escalate. Razor pushed himself up from his booth, his boots thudding heavily on the worn floorboards. The background noise of the bar seemed to soften as he moved, the regulars sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He strolled over to Seagal's table, the rest of his gang watching with predatory anticipation. He loomed over the seated Seagal, a mountain of leather and muscle. "You got a problem with my guy?" Razor asked, his voice a low growl. He apologized for the spill. A real man would accept that. Seagal finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Razor's. His voice was even, quiet. There was no apology, he stated simply. Only an excuse. The calm, factual correction was like a slap in the face. Razor's jaw tightened. "You got a smart mouth, old man." He glanced at the weathered leather jacket, which Seagal had taken off and draped carefully over the empty seat beside him. With a sudden, swift movement, Razor snatched the jacket. "Nice coat," he sneered, holding it up. "Looks like it's seen better days." Before Seagal could react, Razor threw the jacket onto the filthy, sticky floor of the saloon. Then, with deliberate, grinding pressure, he twisted his heavy boot over it, mashing it into a small puddle of spilled beer and dirt. "Oops," Razor mocked, echoing his crony's earlier word. "My bad." He stood back, his chest puffed out, a triumphant smirk on his face, waiting. He had attacked the man's property. He had ground his symbol of identity into the dirt. Now, surely, he would get the fight he craved. Seagal looked down at his jacket on the floor, then back up at Razor. His face was still calm, but a new, dangerous stillness had settled into his eyes. The line had just been crossed. The line is crossed, approximate, 1004 words. Seagal's reaction, once again, defied all expectations. He didn't leap to his feet. He didn't shout. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a man with all the time in the world, he bent down, picked his jacket up from the floor, and gently shook it out. He took a moment to examine the muddy boot print, his expression unreadable. Then, he folded the jacket with meticulous care and placed it on his lap. This act of profound, almost surreal composure was the ultimate insult to Razor. It was a complete and utter negation of his power. He had used verbal taunts, physical assault on property, and direct intimidation, and this old man had refused to grant him the satisfaction of a single flicker of fear or anger. Razor's world, built on the simple physics of fear and dominance, was being turned upside down. His frustration boiled over into pure, unrestrained rage. "That's it!" Razor roared, his voice finally losing its calculated menace and becoming a raw, uncontrolled bellow. "I've had enough of your silent treatment, you arrogant old bastard." He lunged forward, closing the final few feet between them. His large, scarred hand shot out and grabbed the front of Seagal's simple black shirt, yanking him forward. Seagal, though seated, didn't resist the pull, allowing his body to move with the force. Razor's face was now inches from his, contorted in a mask of fury, spittle flying from his lips. "You think you're untouchable, he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can just sit there and disrespect me in my own bar?" His knuckles were white as he twisted the fabric of Seagal's shirt. The other bikers began to rise from their seats, sensing the final, violent release. The bartender ducked down behind the bar. This was it. The point of no return. Razor drew back his other fist, a massive, tattooed club of a hand, preparing to deliver a punch that would end this silent defiance for good. "I'm going to break you." In that split second, as Razor's fist began its journey, the atmosphere in the Iron Horse Saloon underwent a quantum shift. It was as if the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended. The loud jukebox music seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant hum. The boisterous laughter of the other patrons died in their throats. The very air grew thick, heavy, and cold. The change emanated from one place, the eyes of Steven Seagal. The man who had been a passive, quiet observer, the man who had endured every insult with an almost zen-like detachment, was gone. In his place was something else entirely. As he looked up into Razor's enraged face, his own expression transformed. The calm did not break, it hardened. It solidified into a terrifying, predatory stillness. His eyes, which had been neutral and observant, now became two chips of obsidian, cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of fear. They held a look of profound, almost bored competence, the look of a master craftsman observing a flawed piece of work he was about to correct. It was the moment the prey, cornered and provoked, revealed itself to have been the hunter all along. Razor saw it. For the first time all night, he truly saw the man he was holding. He saw the shift, felt the sudden, chilling drop in temperature, and his forward momentum faltered. The punch he had been about to throw hitched for a microsecond, a flicker of doubt, of primal fear, finally penetrating his rage-addled brain. He had expected to see terror in the old man's eyes. Instead, he saw a placid, waiting abyss. And then, Seagal slowly, deliberately, stood up. He didn't push Razor away. He simply rose, his larger frame unfolding from the booth with a fluid power that forced the bigger, but less balanced, biker to stumble back a step, his grip on Seagal's shirt loosening. The quiet man was quiet no more. He was now a towering, silent monolith of impending consequence, and the entire bar held its breath. Razor's hesitation was his undoing. Seeing the man he held not as a victim but as a threat, his brain sent a panicked signal to his fist. He completed the punch he had started, a wide, clumsy haymaker born of fear rather than strategy. Seagal didn't even watch the fist. His eyes were on Razor's shoulder, his elbow, his hip. He saw the telegraphed motion, the poor balance. As the punch sliced through the air, Seagal moved. His right hand came up, palm open, and gently redirected the incoming arm, while his left hand clamped onto Razor's wrist. It was not a block, it was an invitation. He turned with Razor's momentum, a simple, graceful pivot. Razor, expecting to hit something solid, was instead pulled forward into a vortex of controlled motion. Seagal then applied the most basic and humiliating of Aikido's control techniques, kotegeshi, the wrist return. He didn't use strength. He used anatomy. He folded Razor's wrist back upon itself at a perfect, excruciating angle. A high-pitched, strangled scream of agony tore from Razor's throat. The powerful biker, who outweighed Seagal by 30 pounds of pure muscle, was instantly neutralized. His body was forced to follow the direction of the lock to prevent his wrist from snapping. Seagal guided him, with an almost gentle pressure, down to the filthy floor, forcing him onto his knees. The king of the Iron Horse Saloon was now kneeling before the quiet old man, his face a mask of white-hot pain and disbelief. Seagal held the lock for a second, a silent lesson, then released him. "Get him!" Razor shrieked, cradling his wrist. The spell was broken. Two of his lieutenants, including the giant named Tank, surged forward, fueled by pack loyalty and the desire to overwhelm the threat. One came from the left, swinging a beer bottle as a club. The other, Tank, came from the right, his arms wide for a crushing tackle. It was a foolish, chaotic attack, and Seagal met it with perfect, brutal harmony. As the bottle came swinging in, Seagal pivoted, letting it whistle past his head. He continued his turn, his back elbow striking the man's exposed ribs with a dull, sickening thud. The man gasped and folded. At the same instant, Seagal used his spinning momentum to face the charging tank. He didn't try to stop the tackle. He welcomed it. As the giant crashed into him, Seagal dropped his weight, seized the man's arm and the collar of his leather vest, and executed a flawless hip throw, Ogashi. Tank, for all his size, was lifted from his feet and sent flying over Seagal's hip, crashing through the very table Seagal had just been sitting at. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the giant lay groaning amidst the wreckage, utterly defeated. The third biker, seeing his two companions dispatched in seconds, froze, his hand halfway to the pool cue he'd been about to grab. He looked at Seagal, who now stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing still perfectly calm, his dark eyes settling on him. The biker slowly raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. The fight was over. Seagal stood, a silent master, surrounded by the wreckage of their arrogance. The silence that descended upon the Iron Horse Saloon was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the defeated bikers and the faint, ironic cheerfulness of the jukebox, which had never stopped playing. Every patron was frozen, staring at the scene of carnage. They had witnessed not a brawl, but a surgical procedure. The bartender, who had been hiding behind the bar, slowly peeked over the top. His eyes were wide with awe. He had seen hundreds of fights in his establishment, but he had never seen anything like this. It was then that a flicker of recognition, long dormant, sparked in his mind. He had seen this man before, not in person, but on a flickering screen late at night. The ponytail, the calm demeanor, the brutally efficient movements. "Oh my God," the bartender whispered, his voice trembling. He fumbled for his phone under the bar, his fingers shaking as he typed a name into a search engine. He stared at the images that appeared, his jaw going slack. Holy! A woman at a nearby table, who had also been staring intently, let out a gasp. "I know who that is," she said to her companion, her voice a hushed, reverent whisper. That's Steven Seagal." The name, spoken aloud, rippled through the bar like a shockwave. It was repeated in whispers, then in louder, more incredulous tones. "No way. It can't be. Look at him, it is him." The realization dawned on the faces of the patrons first, a mixture of shock, excitement, and awe. They were not just witnesses to a bar fight, they were in the presence of a legend. But the most devastating realization occurred on the floor. Razor, propping himself up on one elbow, his face a mask of pain, heard the name. Steven Seagal. The name connected with a vague memory of old action movies his father used to watch. The quiet man. The Aikido master. The guy who broke wrists. His blood ran cold. The humiliation he felt from the physical defeat was nothing compared to the mortifying, soul-crushing horror that now washed over him. He and his gang had spent the entire evening tormenting, insulting, and assaulting a man they thought was a nobody, a weak old man. And that man had turned out to be one of the most famously dangerous martial artists on the planet. He hadn't been showing restraint out of fear, he had been showing restraint out of a profound, almost pitiful mercy. Razor looked at Seagal, who was now calmly picking up his jacket from the floor, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be truly, utterly, and hopelessly outmatched in every conceivable way. His reign over the Iron Horse Saloon was over, ended by a quiet man who had just wanted a drink. Seagal dusted off his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked not towards the defeated bikers, but towards the bar. The bartender stood ramrod straight, his eyes wide. Seagal reached into his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and laid it on the beer-soaked counter. "For the bourbon," he said, his voice calm, "and for the table." He then turned and walked towards Razor, who was now being helped to his feet by the one biker who could still stand. The biker boss flinched as Seagal approached. But Seagal stopped a few feet away. He looked at Razor, his eyes holding not anger, but a kind of clinical disappointment. "Strength," Seagal said, his voice a quiet lesson that filled the silent bar, "is a responsibility. You used yours to cause pain. That is the definition of weakness." He paused, letting the words land. "Learn from this. Or don't. The world has a way of balancing the scales." With that, he gave a final, almost perceptible nod to the bartender and turned towards the door. As Seagal walked towards the entrance, the patrons of the Iron Horse Saloon, bikers and locals alike, did something extraordinary. They parted for him. They moved their chairs, stepped aside, creating a silent, respectful path to the door. No one spoke. No one dared meet his eye. They simply watched as the quiet man, who had entered as a target, now left as a legend. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the cool desert night, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. He left behind a wrecked corner of a bar, 3 bruised and broken bullies, and a room full of people who had just witnessed a masterclass in the difference between being a tough guy and being a strong man. The jukebox had finally fallen silent, and in the quiet that remained, everyone in that bar was re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about power. The quiet man was gone, but the lesson he taught would linger in the stale air of the Iron Horse Saloon forever. Seagal got into his car. The engine rumbled to life, a low, powerful sound in the vast desert silence. He didn't look back at the bar. His thoughts were already elsewhere, on the long, empty road ahead. He took a slow breath, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally receding, leaving behind a profound sense of calm. Violence was always ugly, a failure of communication, a disruption of harmony. But sometimes, he reflected, it was the only language a certain kind of man understood. It was a necessary tool to restore balance to a world that was constantly trying to tip into chaos. He put the car in drive and pulled out onto the highway, a lone shadow moving through the dark, leaving order in his wake. In a world filled with loud voices and aggressive posturing, true strength often moves in silence. Steven Seagal walked into a den of bullies and, with unparalleled restraint and masterful skill, taught a lesson that no punch could ever convey: respect is a two-way street, and underestimating a quiet man is a dangerous mistake. Have you ever witnessed a moment where calm confidence completely silenced a loudmouth bully? Share your story in the comments below. Show your respect for the quiet strength that commands a room without raising its voice. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe.